No, it is not hopeless, John, because what you've outlined is classic, if I may say so. What you've outlined is what Russia absolutely wants you to state, which is to portray the notion that Russia is somehow unbeatable
Yes.
and that Russia will always vanquish.
And you don't believe that? You believe Ukraine can win?
Let's look at some of the facts. Let's look at the situation.
Now, let's say a very good afternoon to General Sir Richard Shirreff, who's a former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Hello to you, Sir Richard.
Good afternoon, John.
You're very, very welcome, as always. I just want to ask you this. Do you judge it would be possible, is it conceivably possible, to go ahead with this multinational force deployed into Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire unless America gives that security back up? Could it even happen?
I think we have to assume that America will not be part of it. I think we have to assume, after the events of the last 10 days, that we cannot in any way count on America as an ally.
Right.
That's point number one. Point number two is that if and when there is a ceasefire, that will only come when Russia is forced into it. Russia has already made it clear that it is not going to back down on any of its aims. In other words, the annexation of the 4 provinces of eastern Ukraine, a new government, effectively, by definition, therefore, a puppet government in Kiev, the demilitarization of Ukraine, and a permanent neutralization of Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine as a client state of the US. And given that, it seems to me impossible that there will be peace, because the Ukrainians and President Zelensky cannot accept that.
Right.
So that's the second point. However, if we get to the stage where Russia is forced to accept a ceasefire, and that will only come about if Russia is given a serious bloody nose, and we might discuss how you do that later, then there is going to have to be a peace implementation force and a force to guarantee long-term Ukrainian security from Ukraine's allies.
Yep.
So we have to think now about how we could possibly do that without America.
Okay, well, that's a contribution crowded with significant thoughts, Richard. First of all, you think the idea of a ceasefire is pretty much academic. It's not going to happen because you will not see Vladimir Putin cede control of the Donbass, those areas in the east of the country, and still less Crimea. And without that, well, there'll be no ceasefire. In which case, Ukraine must fight on. And now we see Donald Trump toying with the idea, I say toying, but he's considering apparently the idea of stopping military aid to Ukraine. From Ukraine's point of view, Richard, then in the event of the fighting continuing, that would surely be catastrophic.
It would be really, really difficult for Ukraine, no question about that. Ukraine is dependent on the long-range precision missiles, the Patriot air defense missiles, the HIMARS, the ATACMS, and the huge amount of ammunition and other capability that America has given. So it would be really, really difficult. So the only way around that is for Europe and Canada to do what they can to step up to the mark, which requires the mobilization of defense industries and a serious doubling down on military support to Ukraine. Now, it's not going to fill the gap left by the Americans, but my friends in Ukraine tell me that they will go on fighting with or without us, because they know that if they stop fighting, Ukraine will die as a country. And so they will continue with whatever they can. And it's up to us now to give them whatever we can. And I think what we've seen in the last few days, if I may say so, is real leadership from the government and from Keir Starmer in setting the conditions for that. But we must go further.
So, Richard, I mean, following your logic to its conclusion, are you telling me that you believe, and I'm putting it very boldly, that Ukraine's position is now hopeless? Because if Ukraine must fight on, and you do not believe we're going to see conditions that would allow a ceasefire, if Ukraine must fight on, well, then the contest is between Ukraine's capacity to replenish its fighting men and women, and its munitions and its equipment, and Russia's capability of doing that. And Russia has a machine which is geared up significantly to replace the troops on the front line, replace the arms and munitions. Very hard to see Ukraine winning that race, even with European support, isn't it?
No, it is not hopeless, John, because what you've outlined is classic, if I may say so. What you've outlined is what Russia absolutely wants you to state, which is to portray the notion that Russia is somehow unbeatable,
yes,
and that Russia will always vanquish.
And you don't believe that? You believe Ukraine can win?
Let's look at some of the facts. Let's look at the situation. For the last year and a half, Russia has made glacial progress against the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Russia, on the current trajectory of casualties for Russia, by 9th of May, when Putin, in all his vain glory, stands up on the victory parade podium in Red Square, Russia will have lost 1 million soldiers killed or wounded. Russia's got, by the calculations of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, Russia's probably got about a year's worth of armored vehicles left, and most of those are ancient Soviet T-55s and BMP-1s and the like.
Yeah.
The Russian army is dependent for its logistic support on civilian vans, on golf buggies, and on donkeys. The Russians are really, really strapped. And if you then take into account the Russian economy, and there are many who will have come on Times Radio who say that the Russian economy is like a leaky ship and is only kept afloat by desperate measures. The so what for me then is if we can give Ukraine enough to survive and not to blink, Russia ultimately will blink. So it is not hopeless, but it depends on how we in Europe and Canada respond. We've made a good start. But what we've got to go on to do is design a properly thought through strategy, which looks at what Ukraine needs, looks at the gaps what the Americans have made, and then we work out how we fill those gaps by whatever desperate measures need to be done and whatever sacrifices need to be done in our countries and the countries of our allies to achieve that. So the situation is not hopeless.
Right, what a fascinating analysis, and what a challenge then to Keir Starmer and to the leaders of Europe. Appreciate your sharing that with us, Richard. That's General Sir Richard Shirreff, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Now, in the space of days, American policy towards Ukraine has twisted, it's turned, it's stood on its head. Just have a listen to some statements by senior figures close to Donald Trump. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, he echoed the suggestion President Volodymyr Zelensky should resign.
Well, something has to change. Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that. I mean, it's up to the Ukrainians to figure that out. But I can tell you that we are re-exerting peace through strength. President Trump has brought back strength to the White House. We knew that this moment would come. We worked hard for it to come. And now it's here. But we need these parties to go along with this. And we need President Zelensky to do what is necessary. This war has drug on far too long. He's lost hundreds of thousands of people, including women and children. We've got to bring an end to it. And I think our European allies are hoping that that is the case, and we are as well.
Republican leader of the House, Mike Johnson there. Now, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he rejected criticism of the president's policy.
All we're trying to do here is figure out whether a peace is possible. All these other things that people keep bringing up, that'll have to be a part of a negotiation. Right now, there is no negotiation. Shouldn't we at least try to see if there is a way to end this war in a way that's acceptable to both sides and is enduring and sustainable? How is that a bad thing? I really am puzzled why anyone thinks that trying to be a peacemaker is a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when it's Donald Trump trying to do it. When it's President Trump, it's absurd to me.
Marco Rubio there in defensive mode. Let's say hi, good afternoon to Tim Marshall, the foreign affairs expert who's author of The Prisoners of Geography. Hello to you, Tim. Welcome back.
Hi, John.
Tim, do you want to just share your reflections, first of all, on this historic moment? Donald Trump accused by the Wall Street Journal of retreating from the defense of freedom, of siding with Putin. And what are you thinking?
I'm thinking it was not inevitable if you had a different character. But in historical terms, it's not surprising. If you remove principles and shared values from your relationships with other countries, what are you left with? A cost-benefit analysis. I mean, the Americans have always had that. Every country does. Its own interest comes first. But we have become used to, in the last 88 decades, we've become used to standing with the Americans and them standing with us, partly because of our principles and our shared values. So just push them out of the way, because the particular characters in the White House do not have those principles or those shared values. Then put into this equation, Cold War is over, the post-Cold War era, the Americans aren't frightened of the Russians anymore. It's China they worry about. The Russians have proved they can barely get to the Dnieper River, never mind the Atlantic coast. And as well as shared principles, one of the reasons the Americans came into Europe in 1917 and again in 41, 44, and then stayed for the Cold War, they do not want one power dominating the continent to the extent it gets all the way to the Atlantic coast and then looks across to the American eastern seaboard. That's not on the cards now. Russia's proved it. They can't even get to Kyiv. So at that point, if you are a MAGA Trumpite person, it actually makes sense. Now, I disagree with that fundamentally. I think we should still have the shared values and the principles. I think the Americans are actually better off if they can stick with us, and indeed if we pay our own way, which we haven't done. But you can see how you can shape that argument, John. And from their perspective, they're thinking, we don't care about you.
Yeah, and I can understand how that argument might be deployed, Tim, in a private dinner table conversation in Washington D.C. But even that argument, it leaves open the very, very real fear, and it is a real fear and real possibility, that you're consigning Europe to perennial tension, perennial fear, a perennial confrontation with Moscow, as Putin tests his power against Europe. And European power would be depleted. We're now reading, it's not confirmed and it hasn't happened, Tim, but that the president may be considering cancelling military aid to Ukraine.
As he indeed threatened to during his campaign in the run-up to the inauguration. He said, I'm going to go to both sides. I'm going to say, do you want peace? And Putin has been smart enough, and I've argued this with you in the past, John, that he would always be smart enough to play ball, knowing that the terms would be so awful for Ukraine that it looks as if Zelensky isn't playing ball. They then ambushed Zelensky, who'd had an 11-hour train journey and about an 8 or 10-hour plane journey. They ambushed him in the White House with either to humiliate him to the extent that he goes back home a humiliated figure and falls by the wayside, or he pushes back, as indeed the Ukrainian people wanted him to, in which case the deals are off, and it's the Russian side that the White House can make it look as if being reasonable. So, I mean, it's awful. But I go back to the idea, you have to understand, the Americans don't care. This particular administration does not care. And so, no more weapons. If they force the Europeans to pay for their own defense, which Sir Keir suggests we're going to do, but I think may run into the long grass of European politics, then it's win for the Americans because they can keep the relationship together and we actually do pay our way. If they don't, fine. Do what you like. We'll do a nice deal with Russia. We don't really care about Russia anymore anyway. If you can split Russia from China, fine. It is entirely transactional.
Yes.
Morality, principles, values are not entering into the equation of this particular mindset. And a personal view, we need to pony up some money, pony up some defense, get through the next 4 years and hope that this is not the return of American isolationism. It's just America's going through its orange period. Briefly, John, this is really important. I reread Washington's 1976 farewell address just this afternoon. In that address, he says, and I've written them down here, two things. On relations with nations, to have as little political connection with them as possible, and on Europe, why, by interweaving our destiny with any part of Europe, and we should entangle our peace and prosperity in their toils, their rivalries. This goes very deep in the American psyche.
Okay, Tim, it is always so good to hear your thoughts and your analysis.